Self is illusion. Only the person is real. There are some ideas that, by their very nature, are truly life-changing. These ideas are powerful and transformative. Certainly, I've found that to be true in my own life. One such idea is self is illusion. Only the person is real. Of course, an idea like that is not likely to change anything in or for you until, firstly, you understand its meaning and significance. Then you have to internalize and actualize the idea to make it a reality. I first read some of the ideas of the Greco-Armenian mystic George Gurdjieff when I was about 19 or 20. I must say, I couldn't understand what the hell he was on about. To this day, I have grasped only some of his philosophy, but two ideas forcefully expressed by the man, as recounted by perhaps his most famous pupil, P.D. Uspensky, I do understand, and I do know to be true. Those ideas are these. First, a person, that's you or me, has no permanent and unchangeable I. Only the person himself or herself is ontologically real. Secondly, it ordinarily takes a major crisis or some other traumatic event to bring a person to a point of surrender and complete transformation, and to come to know and experience their inner power as a person among persons. In his early years, Gurdjieff participated in expeditions that went in search of ancient teachings. These are partly documented in his book, Meetings with Remarkable Men. His quest supposedly led him to a secret brotherhood from which he seemed to have returned in possession of a very interesting system of ideas, transformative ideas and practices. Gurdjieff studied the way of the fakir, the monk and the yogi, but went beyond them. In 1912, Gurdjieff appeared in Moscow, where he introduced certain ideas and teachings and practices that one of his pupils, Uspensky, called the fourth way, and that his students refer to today as the work, or work on oneself, or simply the system. To this day, Gurdjieff's teachings are very much an oral tradition, transmitted under special conditions from one person to another. Such is the nature of pretty well all occult. That doesn't mean satanic, it means hidden or secret or esoteric teachings. In 1922, Gurdjieff began his work in France, but he also made several well-publicized trips to the United States. He died in France in 1949, but to this day there are Gurdjieff groups, societies, and foundations in many countries, including Australia, where I live. Now, before I go any further, I need to deal ever so briefly with the issue of whether or not Uspensky betrayed Gurdjieff and whether or not Gurdjieff was a fake, a fraud, a con man. Much has been written on these subjects. And I'll simply say this, there's more than a little evidence that Gurdjieff's capacity for self-deception was exceeded only by his ability to deceive others. It's rather ironic. A major theme of Gurdjieff was that we spend much of our lives in a state of hypnotic waking sleep. We deceive ourselves, and as a result, others as well. Perhaps Gurdjieff was no different, even if he did have considerable insight into this existential problem. Perhaps his deception was more conscious, maybe even fraudulent. Perhaps he was just a clever hypnotist. That's all I'll say, because I really don't know where the truth lies as respects the matter. But as Krishnamurti used to say, it's the teachings that matter, not the teacher. So, despite some qualms about the man and his methods, I'm still very much of the view that Gurdjieff has some very important and true things to say, including but not limited to the two ideas that I've already expressed and will elaborate upon. For starters, he rightly understood that most religions have corrupted the teachings of their respective founders, teachings that, for the most part, are psychological in nature. And sadly, in almost all religions, these teachings of the founders have become concretized into dogma. Now, Gurdjieff expounded the ancient wisdom that he said, and I believe as well, underpins all of the world's major religions and mythologies. He stressed the importance of constant self-awareness and self-observation, that is, psychological wakefulness, without which there can be no insight, no understanding, and no psychological mutation. However, there are some ideas of his, for example, the idea that there exist higher levels of consciousness and higher bodies, that I have some difficulty accepting, but we'll put that aside. As respects the illusory nature of the self, I'm going to give you some quotations said to be from Gurdjieff. They're taken from Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous, Fragments of an Unknown Teaching. And they recount Ouspensky's meeting and subsequent association with Gurdjieff. This is what Gurdjieff said. One of man's important mistakes, one which must be remembered, is his illusion in regard to his I. Man, such as we know him, the man-machine, the man who cannot do, and with whom and through whom everything happens, cannot have a permanent and single I. His I changes as quickly as his thoughts, feelings, and moods, and he makes a profound mistake in considering himself always one and the same person. In reality, he is always a different person, not the one he was a moment ago. Man has no permanent and unchangeable I. Every thought, every mood, every desire, every sensation says I. Man has no individual I, but there are, instead, hundreds and thousands of separate small I's, very often entirely unknown to one another, never coming into contact, or on the contrary, hostile to each other, mutually exclusive and incompatible. Each minute, each moment, man is saying or thinking I, and each time his I is different. Just now it was a thought, now it is a desire, now a sensation, now another thought, and so on endlessly. Man is a plurality. Man's name is Legion. That's Gurdjieff speaking as recounted in Ouspensky's book. Now, I myself have said this so many times, but I will say it again because it needs to be said again and again. Most of our psychological and emotional problems, as well as problems in our interpersonal relationships, arise because we tend to identify with one or more of those hundreds and thousands of separate I's and me's in our mind, which are mental images. Every thought, every feeling, every sensation, every memory, and so forth. Many of these are not only hostile to each other, but they're downright antipathetic. Over time, though, these, we'll call them little I's and me's, solidify, so to speak, in our consciousness. Indeed, they tend to set like concrete, so much so that we mistakenly believe that these I's and me's, or any one or more of them, are actually the real person that each one of us is, which is not the case. One of the results being that we tend to perceive things from the completely subjective and distorted perspective of our own self-images. Now, this state of affairs, Gurdjieff pointed out, is a form of self-hypnosis. And we're all very good at it, sadly. Now, these self-images, that's what they are, mental images in your mind, these little I's and me's, are definitely not the real person that you are, that I am. They are nothing more than images in our mind, which we have conned ourselves into believing are the real me, that is, the person that we are. A timid person identifies so closely with the timid me in him or her that they become and act timidly. An angry person identifies with the angry self in them to such an extent and on such a regular basis that they become a person who is angry most of the time. And so it is. So we can go on. The point is this: there is no such thing as a timid person or an angry person. In truth, it is simply the case that there is timidity or anger in the person, such that they act and behave that way. Yet it need not be that way. People have within them the power to change. Self can't change itself, but the person can change. Once we come to understand that we are not any one of those hundreds and thousands of I's and me's that we are constantly generating from one moment to the next, once we start living from the power and presence of the person each one of us is, our lives undergo a radical change. We need to see illusion for what it is. Illusion. Self is illusion. Can you see the truth of that? For some, it takes longer than others to understand this important concept. It's foundational. Simply observe your illusory selves, your false selves, those little I's and me's. Observe them in operation. Won't take you long because we're constantly generating these little selves. Notice how they clamour for your attention. Each one of these little I's and me's is saying to you, buy me, identify with me, be me, satisfy me, give expression to me. The truth is, we are not any of those self-images. Only the person that each one of us is ontologically real. So next time the angry self or the timid self or whatever raises its ugly little head in your mind, just watch it come and go. Say to yourself, that is, the person that you are, this self is not me. It is not the person that I am. I choose not to identify with that self. I let it go. Just do that. Now, as I've said many times before, it often takes a major crisis or a traumatic event to bring a person to self-surrender and transformation. Recovering alcoholics and other addicts know that to be very true. The founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, who had read some of the writings of the great American philosopher, psychologist, and metaphysician William James, understood that ego deflation at great depth was essential for real personal transformation and recovery. Most of us only change in a big way when we are forced to do so. A spouse may leave us, convinced that we will never change. They're fed up with the way we've been living for decades. How can you blame them? Or we lose our job or our finances. In the words of Gurdjieff, only conscious suffering has any sense. The suffering in my own life, the pain caused to others as a result, it had no meaning or purpose, but in the light of recovery and a changed life, the suffering does make a certain sense. Well, at least up to a point. Of course, some people still don't change when these traumatic sort of things happen. Indeed, I've come to believe that there is no one so-called rock bottom. There is really a bottomless pit for each one of us in potentiality, and sadly for some, in actuality. Some people keep falling and falling until death or insanity is the result. Gurdjieff said, man lives his life in sleep, and in sleep he dies. But my friends, it need not be so. We can, we must wake up. Gurdjieff also said, life is real only then, when I am. Life is real only then, when I am. So, my friends, get real. Self can't change. The person can change. Let it happen now.